I often get excited um, before satsang, usually in the morning of the day that I'm going to give satsang. I'll wake up with a whole lot of points that I'd like to bring across, and I get excited because I just have um, this imagination sometimes that, I can say something like this, point at it from this way, and it's going to be clear for someone. um, and who knows, really, what blows break off what bits. But if we keep at it for long enough, then something's bound to happen. So I hope that people are seeing change over a period of time. I really think it's important to say that it takes no time, because part of our attachment to outcome sees life and objectives in the future. And so usually when we engage in something, we're engaging with it with the aim of getting something through the way that we've always approached life, which is, trying to make it happen. And so unfortunately, sometimes when someone approaches a teaching with the same attitude, or all the time when we approach the teaching with the same attitude, what it's actually doing is keeping in place the very same identity that has already been living life. And so, the teachings often say, look, it's not about building a castle brick by brick by brick. That's just not where you're going to find the answers. And from one perspective, that is completely correct. And it needs to be said over and over to just get people to just stop trying to get somewhere. That's what surrender is. Surrender is actually when we're so tired of trying to get somewhere, having tried to climb up the slope and sliding back down and sliding back down. And eventually it's just like it dawns on us that it cannot be done. And so the person stops trying. Now, in the normal scheme of things and from a certain perspective, surrender sounds like failure. It sounds like a tragedy. That, the obstacle was just too great to have overcome, and now the person has lost. But the real surrender is recognizing that the obstacle can't be overcome, and in fact that isn't really an obstacle. As soon as the obstacle stops being an obstacle, it stopped being an obstacle. If salvation was on the other side of the obstacle, then failing to get over the obstacle may be a tragedy. If we think salvation is on the other side of the obstacle, and it's not, then the surrender in trying to get over the obstacle means there's now a presence to experience something different. So what that really all boils down to is, if we're lucky enough to catch that habit, to see the habit of trying to understand something, trying to work hard to get over somewhere, to win, to get to break through, and we feel that this is suffering, That's the important part, because it's a form of suffering. It's a form of uncomfortableness with oneself. The very fact that we are struggling so hard is a result of an uncomfortableness with oneself that has established itself because of a particular movement in life. And it's just stop. You don't need to go there. It's God's will for you to stop if you stop. The narrative is, oh, I'm so lazy, I've stopped, or I'm not getting anywhere because I haven't applied myself. And if you take the perspective, if you stop, if you fail, if you are too tired to carry on, that is God's will. That means that is what God wants, is for the stopping to happen. Or for the being lazy to happen. If it is laziness, it doesn't have to be stopping laziness. Maybe I shouldn't have brought the two in together. It can be confusing. What I'm saying is that we tend to judge ourselves for not meeting our own expectations, which our own expectations are usually put in place by society's expectations or friends, family. And that narrative needs to stop. Who says you have to finish that project? Who says you don't? Just see that whatever you're doing is God's will. Including the struggling to get over the obstacle. That is God's will in that moment. But if you decide it's all too hard, and there is a stopping from the old way of moving, what will probably happen is the narrative will kick in and says, come on, you have to keep going. And there's great relief and long-term change that happens if we can keep remembering that maybe this week was a week to not push ahead. Now, it could be very easy for someone to listen and say, this is terrible advice. People need motivation, they need inspiration to move. And I would not argue with that, but I would explain the rationale. I'd say, look, if we look at people suffering, sure, there are people who suffer because they don't have an internal motivation to move. And if someone were there and motivated them, they might actually move and feel good and thankful that someone motivated them to move. So in that case, I think motivation and inspiration and you can do it, etc., is appropriate. But if we look at what so much of human suffering is, or at least one category of human suffering, One category of human suffering is our own judgment of so many things that we do or fail to do. And often the judgment is because we are not meeting a set of expectations or benchmarks or objectives that we have set in place. So we set them in place saying this is what is important, this is God's will. I mean, we might not say this is God's will. What we've essentially said is that if I don't do this, God will be ashamed of me, or my parents will be ashamed of me. And that I don't want that. I will be ashamed of myself. And so we set up a set of expectations. Now, what if that isn't God's will? Just allow yourself to be as you are. That might mean that you're not the best mathematician, and the best mathematician is not the best cook. We all have our shortcomings and our good points. The funny thing is that we're trying to become perfect because we believe that becoming perfect is where some sort of salvation or reward, or where life will be okay if I can only achieve this, this and this. Then I'll be able to feel good about myself. And some people's destiny is to achieve this, this and this. And then luckily, the reality is that they won't feel satisfied because of achieving this, this and this. And then they're lucky if they realize that they don't feel satisfied, because in that case there's someone who has their own experience and can rely on an observation of their own. So beyond a concept that says happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. Pleasure and pain is to be found in the flow of life. That is the essence of the flow of life, pleasure and pain. The concept says your happiness is never to be found in the flow of life. It's never to be found in getting somewhere. And yet here we are, like hamsters on the hamster wheel, trying to get somewhere, thinking that that's where our happiness will be found. So if someone does spend a long time focused on the material objectives and receives it, then there's good fortune in receiving it, not because it will deliver happiness, but because there's an opportunity for that person to eventually realize and clock it down to personal experience, put a tick next to the concept and says, see, there it is. I've moved on from this objective, got that, then didn't have the long-lasting, ongoing happiness I thought would come with it. It doesn't hold up against criticisms and against expectations that don't get fulfilled. It doesn't prevent you from not feeling uncomfortable with yourself. And so then we might have said, oh, okay, it must be some other objective. So we set another objective and we get that, and that doesn't deliver ongoing happiness. And so then we say, it must be something else. So we set something else up. And, we'd think that, 2, 3 times, maybe 4 times at the absolute most of getting what we think will give us happiness will be enough for us to see the pattern and say, maybe that's not where my happiness is to be found. But it seems like the program is so deep that we just keep going back and back to the assumed source of happiness outcomes. And until that habit starts getting cut off through our own internal movement, a thought comes up that sees the habit and feels the consequence of that habit. When the thought and the awareness land on that dynamic and start questioning it, start maybe seeing it much more than just questioning it, but really go, oh, I get what that the teachings are saying. And it's getting that with some sort of conviction that allows the movement to really get interfered with. Just repeating, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, when really you don't know what that means, or you haven't really seen it to be true, is unfortunately, what happens a lot in religions, and it's just a repeating of a mantra. It's not entirely fruitless, because maybe eventually, after the mantra has been repeated 1,000,000 times, with the thinking not really lining up with what the mantra is saying, and yet it's being said over and over again for 10 years, and then 10 years down the track, some sequence of events happen, and this flash of insight happens, because the mantra is then seen in action, and we get to see the representation in our own life of what the mantra has been saying. And that's when we go, I've been repeating this for 10 years and I had no idea what it was saying. I had no idea what it meant, until a series of events happen and it just sinks in. So lately I haven't we haven't had much time for questions. So I thought today I would open it up for questions earlier. So if anyone wants to put their hand up, we'll go to questions once someone has one. Don't leave it too long, or I might just get into another stream of thought. Hi. Hello.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, I
Yeah.
can. Very good.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
Hello. See, I would like you to give some to offer some new conditioning, please, about boredom as a form of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
How is it related? Like how where it fits and how it works inside the mechanism, please.
Yeah. So boredom is it's very important because I don't mention the word boredom very often, but it is a form of suffering, and it's in a way it's a mild form. It not necessarily mild in terms of how it feels, because it can feel quite uncomfortable to be bored, especially if you are bored a lot. It's linked to attachment to outcome. It's where the system is saying, my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and I don't have satisfying outcomes at the moment. And it's coupled with, I don't have anything interesting, anything that is making me excited, or anything that feels good. And it's not just that there is nothing that feels good. Really, the boredom feeling, the uncomfortable feeling, is more about a disconnection with self, because but that disconnection from self is a result of the deeply ingrained attachment to outcome that the human system tends to get forced upon it. And that detachment from oneself means that in the absence of something to keep us occupied, there is no acceptable ground that we can rest in and sit in. Now, obviously, this is not necessarily going to be the constant experience for someone. Like with most suffering, there will be patches of the suffering. So what I'm describing is not necessarily how someone is in totality, but when it happens, we hopefully get to see it as a sign. And the description I would say is that this is a disconnection from myself, a disconnection from the deeper part of who I am. That can be said for all of the suffering, all of the different forms of suffering, which really, as I've said, the core of all of the different forms of suffering is what we can call, because when we feel it, we just say this is an uncomfortableness with oneself, or an uncomfortableness with life, an uncomfortableness with the other. But all of those uncomfortablenesses with life and with the other really come back to being an uncomfortableness with oneself. It's an uncomfortable feeling that if it wasn't there, the thought I am bored wouldn't even arise. There would just be a comfortableness with sitting down, doing nothing, not even thinking. I'm not doing anything. There would just be a comfortableness, like when, let's say, you are tired from doing a lot of work, and you get to sit down, and there is a relief in sitting down. And the absence of boredom would mean sitting down, being grateful for the fact that that is what is happening. So, in short, I guess, that was the long part. To summarize, it's boredom is an uncomfortableness with oneself. It is because of a layer of suffering that is running. That layer is linked to attachment to outcomes, and the practice of coming back to abide in I am, which is inspired by the thought that arises and say, look, my happiness isn't dependent on outcomes, and that might inspire us to keep coming back to a presence, which is essentially a cutting off of the movements, the psychological movements that tell us what life is about. Working hard, doing things, enjoying things, accumulating things. Now, that's not going to work in the moment you're bored. A lot of people take this as, the answer when I'm bored is to drop into being. The truth is that when we are suffering, it's very hard to apply the magic pill then. Really, what needs to happen is an earnestness in seeking, I guess, we could say, must happen, where we are interested in coming back to being, even when there isn't suffering, or when there isn't intense suffering. And that movement eventually, I think, establishes a connection to oneself. Yeah. Hi, Martin.
Hello, Roger. It's really great to hear you again, and I'm very grateful. My question is, could you say something about envy and the fear of missing out? How do these feelings, how can I put it? Well, I just call them feelings. How do these feelings relate to the 5 forms of suffering?
Well, this too is very much attachment to outcome, because in the case of envy, we're looking at someone and looking at what they have, right? Comparing ourselves to them, and essentially saying, I am envious of what they have that I don't have. And the only reason we're saying that is because we believe that what they have is very important. And when we really dive down into it, we're not saying what they have is very important because it's pleasure. we're really at the very core of our structure, we're saying what they have is very important because it is happiness. It is the source of their happiness. And if I had it, it would be the source of my happiness. The fear of missing out is essentially the same sort of movement based on the same idea that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so we say, well, I can't not go out today because I might meet, my soulmate. If I don't go out, I might miss that opportunity. And so in both these cases, I would suggest that the thought, if the thought arises when you feel the uncomfortableness, the thought arises, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. So yes, you might miss out, but what you miss out on is some pleasure or some pain. You're not in control of whether you get pleasure or pain when you go out. And to keep coming back to a place that is not that movement. Every time we actually go out because of the fear of missing out, what is happening is we are reinforcing the belief that says, my happiness is to be found in finding my soulmate. So a movement, first of understanding and of thought, but very importantly, that thought actually has to start interfering with our movements, because so many of our movements are habits, our objectives, our preferences, not so much our biological preferences, but the things that are the psychological attachments, without us knowing it, are reinforcing the idea my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So what I mean by this is that someone can be listening to the teachings, sort of get it intellectually, oh, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, and yet in practice, the movement is by seeking those outcomes, and not only thinking about them, but actually pursuing them. That pursuing of them is confirming, sort of like actions speak louder than words, is the movement is saying, yes, I believe that this is where my happiness is to be found. So if we can start interfering with those movements, we are actually affecting the ingrained belief in the most effective way. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Is it any better to go after things knowing that it's only pleasure?
Yeah, sure. So remember that when I say, for example, a movement has to happen to interfere with, let's say, the habit. I'm not talking to Martin, who is in control of this happening. I'm just describing that at some point, a movement to interfere with certain movements might start to happen in a way what we could call naturally, where it's not forced. Let's say an explanation is given that says, if you keep moving in that direction, every time you move in that direction, it undermines the notion your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, because the system is really saying, well, actually, I think that's rubbish. And so at some point, if we understand this, there'll be more of a motivation. And that motivation is not a motivation of a doer, it's a motivation that arises. And so it might not arise for 3 weeks, let's say. And so in the interim, I don't think we should be saying, oh, I have to stop certain movements. Because then that have to is the doer coming in and saying, it's my job to stop those movements. And then that movement is in itself a doership movement that will feel very uncomfortable. And it will ultimately lead to a frustration, either a frustration because of a psychological desire to stop the movement that is out of line with the habit that is saying go in that direction. So, that can be sort of a tug of war. Or there'll be a frustration in the failing to stop that movement. And then we feel deflated that, I wasn't good enough to stop the habit. So if you can even see, so what you said is it useful to see it as a movement towards pleasure? That's one distinction that we can make, that whenever you are moving towards something, the best that it is pleasure. So it's very good for us to know that intellectually. So we say, okay, this that I am afraid of missing out on is at best pleasure. At worst, it's pain. And so then that puts it into a certain perspective. If we are moving after it, even if we might say it's pleasure, but then we see that we're moving after it, still with a layer of our system saying, it's much more than pleasure, that's going to give me what I'm really looking for. So then we can allow that to happen. That would be my suggestion, because fighting these things and saying, this is not what I should be doing, I should have more discipline, I should be able to cut off these feelings, or that, I don't think that's particularly useful. So watching it and being able to see it as a movement of desire and attachment is very useful. That's enough, actually. Enough for what? I mean, I'm not talking about enough as an objective. I'm saying that's pretty good. If you can see the desire and the attachment and call it for what it is, that's a huge insight, observation, development, understanding that most people simply don't have in life, and that's why that movement continues. So sure, the movement might continue for you for another 3 months or whatever, but if you're seeing it over and over as a movement of suffering, a movement of misunderstanding, a movement of ignorance, but you're not judging it, you're just knowing what it is. That knowing of what it is having probably a big effect on its long-term stability. Whereas if it's not seen for that, essentially we're going forward, and instead of undermining the foundation by calling it ignorance, even if calling it ignorance doesn't stop it, but we really say, this truly is suffering, and I can see my system believes that if it were to get a certain outcome, my system really believes that that is what I need in life. That's what will satisfy me. So just seeing that is doing the very opposite of moving in that direction without seeing it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Just one more question. Is it generally true that feeling less dramatic about things is a good sign?
Yes. You see, the attachment tends to make everything personal, and it tends to heighten the appreciation, or it tends to heighten the value of pleasure. Not actually, but how we assume pleasure to be more valuable than it's worth. And we take pain to be more serious or significant than it actually is. And so I think as that attachment tends to fall away, as we tend to become more and more clear that the flow of life is outcomes, pleasure or pain, and that my happiness, really what that means is my true essence, my core, is not dependent on pleasure or pain. As that sets in, we tend to be much more capable of sort of saying, oh well, these things happen. these things happen, as opposed to someone who is attached to outcomes. Someone who's attached to outcomes and their outcome, is taken away from them or doesn't happen. They don't feel like it's okay, these things happen. They feel assaulted on a very personal level. And so the response, the reaction tends to be more dramatic. Now remember, this is not a criticism or a suggestion that there is someone doing this. I'm saying that life has structured us all in very particular ways. And just like your question implied, is if life restructures us a particular way, is it true that we might become more equanimous regardless of the outcome, less dramatic, that the peaks and the troughs become sort of evened out? And I would say, yes, that happens. It's not something that someone does. It's something that happens to someone. And so, this is what the principle of being lived is all about. It's saying that life has shaped me, and really it's like life is driving me in each moment, driving my reactions or my lack of reactions in the case of the example that we've used here. So we really are being lived, whether we realize it or not. So whether anyone knows that they're being lived or not, we're all, every single one of us, being lived. And the funny thing is that everyone for all of time has been being lived, and no one will ever, according to the concept in this teaching, will ever not be being lived. And it's simply about us
That's really funny.
yeah, waking up and seeing, oh wow, I have never done anything. I have always been being lived. And this is a great freedom if it kicks in earnestness, if it's a realization that happens. And sometimes we talk about realizations and they seem very foreign things. Or realization, it's, I just need to wait for thunder or lightning to strike me. And in a sense it is like that, because we don't know how our neurology and all of the chemistry, the genes and up-to-date conditioning all tie in with each other. So in one way it is sort of like being struck by lightning. But on the other hand, these insights very much have to do with blocks of how we see life, or standardized ways of seeing life being deconstructed. And so sometimes just a specific explanation, like no one has ever been the doer. No one has ever been an independent, separate entity that isn't acting exactly according to how life has shaped them. Now, life has shaped us to think that we are. That's the cruel joke. Life has created 6-8 billion, whatever we are now, human beings, none of which are the doers, all of which are being lived, and they've been lived to include an idea that we are the doers, independent and separate from life, and therefore we end up hating each other because we see the other as the doer and myself as the doer, so we hate ourselves. We see the other as a competitor and an enemy and a rival or a friend that is on our side. And really, we're all in it together. The 6 billion of us are all essentially universal brothers and sisters, part of life, each playing exactly the specific role. Another unfortunate tragedy in this is that life seems to be very cruel. I mean, when we look at the behavior of human beings, we're a cruel bunch. And that's inescapable.
Still, I think eventually it's very comforting to know that we are all one in the end, being lived by life.
Yes. Let me just add, as for all the cruelty, there is an immense amount of love out there. In fact, it is very much a world of duality, and it, in all likelihood, completely balances itself out to the smallest particle. So the vision of seeing everything as one is a transcending of the tragedy of the duality, actually. So what you just said is spot on.
I would like to know if it's a typical part of the journey to have the feeling that I don't really care for myself in a sufficient way. Like, if you really cared for yourself, if you really knew how important you were, you wouldn't be so fill in the blank. You wouldn't be so lazy. You wouldn't be so unsuccessful. Is it a kind of good sign to feel this fear of not sometimes I have this feeling I should stand up for myself. I should, all the shoulds. And I hope you're going to say that this is the big part of the journey, because my part that is wholesome and is healthy, in inverted commas, is slowly taking over, and my ego comes up with all these feelings of you should really do something about the situation. You can't let go. If you really knew how what could be possible for you, then you wouldn't give up. And you know what I'm aiming at?
Yeah. So the irony really is that when we surrender and stop trying to be something that we have conceived, some conceptual sense of who we need to be in this life. When we surrender, what ends up happening is our real valuable characteristics get to shine. And it's not at all what the ego thinks, because the ego is convinced that it is the only doer of things. It is the only valuable part of the human being, and it says, well, if I stop, we're not going to get anywhere. And that's the doership belief, right? The fact is that we have always been being lived. We're never moving because of some doer that is in control. And that movement, that doership movement, is actually very good at sort of hijacking the system. And the other parts of the system have sort of no choice but to fade into the background. And it's only once that egoic movement that is sure that it is the one driving the bus and in control, it's only when that starts to fade away that these other aspects get to shine. And so the irony is that in surrendering, even to laziness, that is probably the beginning of a shift out of that dynamic. Not to say that what we call laziness, I mean, someone who enjoys nature and maybe is fortunate enough not to have to work to generate an income, may be calling themselves lazy just because they're not working to generate an income. And what they might actually have the opportunity to do is to enjoy the wonders of life. And yet it's only an idea that says, oh, I'm lazy because I'm not doing, what other people are doing, working hard and, being successful in this, that, and the other. So even the task of seeking, seekers often get sort of hijacked from everyday life in its normal grind, and it's like life pulls them off and says, "Yep, you don't have an interest in that anymore," and they are seekers. They'll watch hours and hours of videos and read books and go on retreats, and their life is seeking. And so very often a doubt comes in and says, is this really a valid way of spending life? And I would say that, it's one of the most valuable activities, projects that one can dedicate their life to. And yet, our expectation, our concept of what is valuable can come in and completely diminish the value of seeking. So, I wouldn't be too concerned about that voice kicking up. What I would be more interested in reinforcing is the fact that it is the voice of the doer that can't comprehend that if that were to stop, that there would be something valuable underneath.
Maybe the adjective lazy is not such a good word. I was rather thinking about carelessness, being careless about yourself and about life, but it ties in with what you were saying. Maybe you can exchange the two because the dynamic is the same. Mm-hmm. And it's I guess it's a kind of cosmic irony that caring for yourself by being a seeker is, in the end, maybe much more rewarding than being active and pursuing a way of life that society says is useful.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the big problem that we're addressing here is it's not an encouragement and saying that anyone who is working hard is on the wrong track. The reason that we talk about this stopping from doing certain things is because often we're engaged on that particular track, in that particular direction, in a way that does reinforce the uncomfortable sense of self and covers up the potential of us connecting to the deeper part of ourself. And so that's why this is being said. The movement towards objectives and producing things in and of itself is not a problem. It's the attitude with which it's done. And so I would reinforce that if we did give ourselves the freedom to be anything that we happen to be in the moment without judging it, which is to say, if I am a seeker, it's God's will. If I am working hard, it's God's will. If I am helping people, it's God's will. If I'm being selfish, it's God's will. And really understand what that means in the sense of, I am not going to get in the way and pretend I know what God's will is, which is what we're always doing when we say, oh, you should be more, productive, you should be more careful, you should be more loving. This is a suggestion of drop your conceptual ideas, your expectations, and allow yourself to be lived. See yourself being moved in each moment. And the biological intelligence of the body will, once there is the willingness to see where the day will take us. The day takes us in ways that are not that mysterious, in that if the doorbell rings, the likelihood is that there will be a movement towards opening the door. That's once we say, oh, I don't have to open the door. I don't know what the day is meant to look like. And so you can go into the moment, which is, even if the doorbell rings, I don't know if I'm going to answer it. So we have to give ourselves that freedom of challenging the shoulds and shouldn'ts to that degree. Say, what if I don't feel like opening the door? Well, what a novel thought. Can it be that if I don't feel like answering the door, I don't answer the door, knowing that that is God's will? And so once we've given ourselves that freedom of, I don't know what's going to happen, then answering the door may happen. And if answering the door happens, when we look at it, we go, it's not so strange that answering the door happened because the doorbell rang. And in the same way, if hunger arises, then moving towards food will happen. We underestimate how we have taken so many options off the table with our preconceived notions of how we have to act in a certain way. So, yeah. Who knows what the day is going to look like. You're welcome, Martin.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, it's been a very wonderful time with you. Thank you so much for taking the time, and God bless you.
Thank you, Martin. Hi, Salt.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
I have a question about guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And if you allow me, I will put the question through an example, a hypothetical example, and then maybe you can confirm it or correct it or help me understand it. So the example would be that let's say I am driving a car and I'm texting while driving, and then I hit somebody, and then the person drives and dies. So then the way I see it, there can be three outcomes after this. One is sort of the default outcome. Basically, I feel guilty that I've done this terrible thing, and then I blame myself, I hate myself, might even kill myself. So I basically suffer. And then number two, if I feel nothing, no feelings whatsoever, that basically makes me a psychopath. And then number three, maybe the ideal situation, is if what I feel is pain, I feel sadness, I feel the sadness of the family members and all of that. But I don't blame myself because I know that at that time, that was God's will basically, and I couldn't have done anything else. Obviously, I learned from my mistake, and the next time I'll be. I'll never do this again, probably. So basically the question is this somewhat accurate, or would you describe this situation differently? And this entire question is about conscience as well, and sort of the role of conscience and the interplay between conscience and guilt, and the role of these things in living together in a society.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's good that you use the example. I think that helps. So I would see it more or less the way you see it. Often, I think in the movement from one position, let's say the position where guilt is the normal response, guilt and shame, the movement tends to include a sort of overshoot, as part of the deconstructing, we tend to overshoot in the other direction, and then once we've overshot in the other direction, there tends to be an integration back to a more paradoxical is one word that applies to it. A more balanced is another word that applies to it. Position in the spectrum. So the overshoot from being guilt is to maybe even go to the point, a place where you're closer to a psychopath point of view without actually being a psychopath, because when we look at it, we'll see that overshoot is a thought identity actually that's setting in, and then we see that, and it comes back to the middle. And that overshoot includes something like a seeing of how having lived a certain way for our whole life has been very restrictive. So let's change the example just for my elaboration part of it, which is you've been someone that pleases people for your whole life. And you've been doing that because you think it's valuable. The system thinks that it's valuable. And at some point it's pointed out in seeking, let's say, that is a particular egoic trait. And that freedom is not in doing all of these shoulds and shouldn'ts. It's in allowing yourself to be much more natural and whatever. And so in breaking out of the shackles of being a people pleaser, we might rebel against pleasing people. Someone might ask you to do something, and previously you would have, jumped through hoops to do it, and now you tell them to, bugger off. Who do you think I am? Your servant or whatever. Because there's a rebellion against that. And so we swing to the other extreme. And in the end of that movement, because eventually that will become seen that it's sort of like it's an overreaction because of a trauma that exists. And eventually we find that we can not reside in the old place without needing to be so extreme. And that's part of the balancing. And so part of the I'm not the doer or everything is God's will can become a movement that will even prevent us from feeling remorse. Going back to your example of the car accident. So in interfering with the guilt and shame, which feels so uncomfortable and heavy, and we see it as maybe a hindrance in life or not our true nature. We might see that it's an attitude towards circumstance, and there can be a swinging to the other side where we have no space to take any responsibility. So it becomes that essentially, in order for us to not go into guilt, we have found a way to psychologically make the circumstance. We've essentially transcended or bypassed the practicalities and the actualities of daily life, and it has now become, by creating a bypassing that's all God's will, we sort of say, that the subtleties that you mentioned about feeling remorse or pain and feeling the pain of the family, by saying it's all God's will, there will be people who are at a particular part of the process that will say that to the family members of the person, the child, let's say, who has died, as part of their trying to break out of the guilt and the shame. And in hindsight, after that process, the person will realize how ridiculous that was, and yet at the same time how very much part of the process it was. And So I would say that when we come back to a balanced point of view, we have a complete understanding about the paradox of life, and in particular, it's much less. It becomes not so much a paradox when we realize the two levels of the circumstance and the flow of life, and our attitude to the flow of life. And the truth of the matter is that guilt and shame is a retrospective feeling about circumstance, and it is on this level of attitude. Now, guilt and shame doesn't serve any purpose. It doesn't it doesn't serve a positive purpose. It doesn't bring the person back to life. And so if we become clear that there is attitude towards circumstance, and that affects how we feel internally, it doesn't fix circumstance. And then there is flow of life, which is circumstance. So there are the two different layers. And the relationship between you and the family member of the person that has died is part of the flow of life. So if we start to become clear between the attitude to circumstance in its retrospective view versus the interaction in life in the present moment, the circumstance interaction, that's when we might start to see that these two areas have become blurred as part of the understanding. And part of the shift often requires us to not have this distinction, because the distinction in a way dilutes down the notion that everything is God's will. And it's that notion that everything is God's will that needs to be there to break these very unfortunate and deeply ingrained habits. But the consequence is, in the process of breaking that, we tend to swing to the other extreme, which is not balanced, but it's necessary. So conscience is not about a retrospective thing. Conscience is more important. When you ask about conscience, it's more important about someone's movement in life, going forward, or how they function in the present moment. Now, if the notion it's all God's will is simply a deeply intellectual, in a position where it's just intellectual, it can interfere with conscience. But once it starts to find its balanced perspective, what we find is that hurting people, being rude to people, is not pleasant to us, and that's what becomes part of the correcting of the overshoot in the movement. Is that we end up with a layer that says, even if it's all God's will, a certain relationship in circumstance doesn't feel good. And so then we start refining where we can circumstantially act a certain or function a certain way, and attitudinally have another attitude. So or have the attitude that is free of guilt. So I guess to round up, I would say that the guilt is about things that have happened. Conscience is about things that will happen or are happening now. And it isn't even about you should have conscience. To me, conscience, like everything else, is something that is there because of our genes and up-to-date conditioning in that particular moment. And I'm not sure that conscience is going to be there in a greater sense if there is guilt and the attitude of guilt and shame. Because to me, conscience is not on the attitudinal level. Conscience is more on the true self side of things. And So I wouldn't be worried about the attitude of doership, which allows the attitude of doership falling away, which means less guilt and shame, isn't necessarily going to mean less conscience. In the same way that when our attachment to outcomes falls away, sometimes a very valid question is asked. It's like, if I have no attachment to outcomes, what is going to move me in any direction in life? And I'd say, you see, the question comes from the assumption that what moves us in life is attachment to outcomes. And if the attachment to outcomes fall away, what we still have is our biological functioning and our biological preferences. And that is what will move us towards certain outcomes, certain pleasures, once the attachment to outcome has fallen away. Because the body on a biological level is still going to move towards pleasure and move away from pain, but without the psychological insistence that the pleasure is delivered and the pain is not delivered. And conscience, I would say, is similar in nature, in that it is part of the true self. And so, in fact, if guilt and shame were to fall away, my suggestion is that someone's true conscience will be able to function much more freely, especially because I think we end up seeing that all of these psychological movements are a result of trauma, a result of pain, and they create inside of us a movement that wants to win in various different ways, and that winning is aggressive in a way. It's competitive. It makes the other into an enemy or a rival. And so hurting people, as that part of our identity falls away, becomes less and less appealing, or we're less and less motivated to do that. So I think that's part and part of how the conscience actually gets to function without the psychological self in place.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that distinction. Do you think it would be correct to say that conscience is essentially a social function, and then maybe if guilt falls away, what remains is empathy and basically being the ability to feel what's hurting the other person, so I'm not going to do that?
Yes.
A good summary.
I do see that it's very much as you've described. A lot of you see, the falling away of doership and attachment to outcomes comes with certain appreciations that we may not be in a position to appreciate until we are. And so one of those appreciations, I think, is that aggression. So take driving. Driving is a good example. You have people driving, and if you're driving slow, which I have a tendency to do because I just don't really like driving fast, because accidents happen when you drive fast. Or rather, if you're driving fast and an accident happens, it's likely to be more of a problem, or it's more likely to happen because you can't stop when something comes out in front of you or whatever, which doesn't mean driving slow is going to make you free from accidents. But anyway, I tend to drive slow, and a lot of people in life are not interested in going slow. They've got a lot of places to get very quickly, and anyone who's driving slow tends to be their enemy, because they are going to make them 1.5 minutes later to their destination than they would have been otherwise. And so what we see, if we're looking for this, we see a lot of aggression coming out of people through the rear vision mirror. We see it through our rear vision mirror. And you wonder, why is this person so angry at someone who may not, let's say, be able to drive fast because they, can't move their neck as much as they used to be able to. They can't process so many things. Their car maybe is older and they don't feel comfortable in the car. A whole lot of reasons. A lot of them are to do with age. As someone gets older, they can't react and move as quickly and process things in the way that they used to when they were younger. And so for young people, this hasn't happened, so there isn't an appreciation of that. So a young person can yell at an older person, get angry, hoot the horn at someone who's driving slowly. Maybe someone isn't familiar with the roads in those areas. They're trying to navigate and have to go slow to see road signs or whatever. And often if we can't put ourselves into those people's shoes, we can't understand why someone is doing what they're doing. And once we end up in those people's shoes, we understand that an old person, not all old people, but the brain starts to work slower, so they can't process what's happening on the streets maybe as quickly as someone who's young. And so then our motivation to get angry at someone for driving like that may be inhibited or may get cut off by an appreciation that they can't help it, that this is actually the most sensible thing for them to be doing, to drive slow in order to be able to, manage driving more safely. And so then there's a compassion for someone driving slowly instead of this driving up behind them, hitting on the horn, without any appreciation why. So this ties into an empathy, a compassion, and especially an appreciation of how if we are in a position where we start to feel how aggression is not pleasant, then we find less and less that we want to be aggressive. So there's a compassion that often comes with understanding, and the understanding is often part of what is needed to undo doership. Because in the example I've used, if we start to appreciate, because as we start getting older, our functions start to stop working the way they used to, we appreciate, this is happening not because I'm doing it, just because the machinery is breaking down. And so that gives us a great insight into, you see, this is when I'm young and I can, do most tasks. We think we're invincible. And so I think a lot of things in life that introduce humility are very valuable. And humility comes with a recognition that we're not the doers and we're not in control of the outcomes, and that at some point pride will turn into an embarrassment if we remain feeling proud, because we'll see how fragile that success and those abilities are, which then means a compassion and a humility for the full range of humans, knowing that I could be them at some point in the future, or if I was born with a disability that's not in my control, I would function differently to the way that I do. And then seeing other people function at different standards becomes very understandable to us. And hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much for this elaboration and for all the time that you are putting in to these explanations.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the questions. They help. Hi, Terence.
Hi, Roger. I think in some of your other videos, you mentioned a bit about energetic sensations and constrictions, contractions in the body. And it seems like from my experience, the experiencing of these seem correlated, or they have something to do with the feeling of being of personal identity and being a separate self and separate doer. But I'm not sure quite exactly what the exact relationship is. They just feel somehow related, and I guess the strength of that feeling of having a personal identity seems correlated to these things. Could you explain that a bit more?
Let's see if there's one dynamic that may make it hard to understand the correlation is the fact that our thoughts, as far as we experience them, seem quite they seem to have nothing to do with the body or energetics. They often appear as, like a cloud in the sky, or something that is not linked to the body. We see our thoughts in the mind, let's say, and so they don't tend to have an energetic quality to them that we get to appreciate experientially. They just don't present like that. Essentially, I think what we end up experiencing is an interface, a sort of, let's say, useful or not so useful version of what is going on, and what's going on. What we get to see may be a fairly what's the word? Selected or partial interface or version of what's going on in the background. But we only get to see that interface, so we end up relating to the interface. The interface meaning our emotions, our feelings, our thoughts, body sensations, all of that. And we assume that they are it. That is it. So the thoughts that we are familiar with, I would suggest, are completely energetic. There is a huge store of energy that supports all of our thoughts, or that our thoughts are outputs of. And so essentially deeply ingrained belief systems, which are the backbone, the source of all of our thinking, is the big energetic load, almost like you could imagine it like a piece of uranium, let's say, emanating off energy, but in itself being a huge energetic store. And so these belief systems, the psychological self, is an amazing store of energy. And one of the ways to to start getting a sense that there is that it is a store of energy, is when we start feeling emotions, because emotions have a very different quality. Emotions and suffering, which sometimes are treated separately. You can talk about emotions as being just biological emotions, and suffering as being not emotions, but suffering. Or you could call guilt and blame, shame, part of the range of emotions. So anyway, whatever it is, feelings, these feelings that are there, when we start feeling feelings, they tend to be closer to what we could call energetic than thought. Thought feels sort of very disconnected from the body. Emotions are more in the body. Now, I've got a concept that says that the emotion that we feel and the suffering that we feel is essentially very concentrated forms of thought. When we dive into the emotion, if someone is able to allow the emotion to express itself, which is just allow the words to come out, there's going to be a word out of that very uncomfortableness. It's like, I hate you for what you have done. And we can sometimes be surprised at what comes out when the emotion is allowed to express itself in words. And so my suggestion is that actually the emotion is a whole lot of concepts, thoughts, that are so concentrated, and the story, the narrative in the emotion is about me and what you have done to me and what I didn't do for you or whatever. And so that whole story about a me and the other creates a very uncomfortable sense of who I am, which is the suffering. And the same can be said for emotions of happiness and sadness, is that essentially if we were to allow the emotion to express itself, why we are happy, it's like, oh, I'm so happy because I'm free, or whatever the situation is. And it tells us what the thought at the root of that feeling is. And so further down is the store of deeply held beliefs that as they radiate out, so the excess energy, like radiation or uranium will send out radiation. What it's sending out is the thoughts and the emotions and suffering. So when these deeply ingrained beliefs start shifting, there is essentially a big release of energy. It's sort of like a splitting of an atom that happens. So when it's in its place, we don't get to feel that energy on the... so we could call that the unconscious, let's say, all of the deeply ingrained ideas of who we are. And when it's there, it's in the unconscious, we don't get to feel it, we only get to see what comes out, the thoughts and the feelings. When certain beliefs are being dislodged, those beliefs are being dislodged from the unconscious structure of who we are. And that dislodging tends to throw out much more perceptible energetic shifts, and can start creating movements in the body, energetic movements in the body, because the whole structure is essentially changing, rewiring, redistributing the energy amongst, sort of the system. Some beliefs act as blockages in the energetic pipeworks, let's say, and when those blockages start to fall away or crumble, it's a bit like water pressure being blocked, and then a blockage dissolves because they put Drano down the drains and it dissolves, and the water gets to gush through pipes that it hasn't gushed through before. And so we end up with a lot of energetic movements in the body. And if we were to look at the energetic patterns, the beliefs of doership and attachment are about a me, and they're very concentrated, and so the energetic sense tends to be very localized, body-centric, about me, looking at the other and objects in very separate ways, because our story about me is about outcomes, and obviously fear about not getting the outcomes, fear of the other who can take things away from us. And as those ideas start to dissolve, the concentrated energetic forms leave the system, and there's more space for, I guess what we could say, more spacious, more less dense sort of energies. And all of that affects how we feel energetically, both in terms of spaciousness and contractedness. They affect the energetics on the body system. So we get twitches in the body, we get sore muscles, contracted muscles. There can be unexplained kundalini movements when we're asleep, spontaneous movements in meditation. And I think it's all very much linked to the fact that beneath the surface there is a structure of deeply ingrained beliefs, and these beliefs are energetic, and so a change in all of that means we're going to feel things energetically.
I see. And in your, I guess you have an intensive in October. Is that specifically designed to teach practices to facilitate this release? And is that, I guess, I suppose that is conducive to experiencing more and more the feeling of non-doership and so forth?
Yeah, so for those that don't know, there are some intensives coming up. So I think you're referring to the third or fourth one.
Yeah, I think the fourth one.
Fourth one, yep, called Energetic Blocks and Emotional Release. And that is focusing on an aspect that tends not to be focused on when we're focusing on, let's say, witnessing and abiding in I am, because witnessing tends to be about just watching movements without being particularly drawn into them, without necessarily feeling them from a personal perspective. In fact, it encourages to just see them as impersonal movements. And that's a very important part of the process. And at the same time, at the right time, we have to hear that there is a lot of validity in leaving the witnessing aside for a little while and allowing these energies to really be felt in a way that the emotions that are locked away get to be expressed. And that tends not to happen when the witnessing is what the focus is on. So yes, I think describing the interplay between energetic beliefs, how they get put in place, which often has to do with events that are painful and have been interpreted as personal and about me and about the other, caused by me or the other. So doership and attachment to outcome. The doership is who did this to whom, and the attachment to outcome is the pain or the pleasure that was part of that circumstance. And so talking about how it all links in means that there probably is a shift. So I would expect people to join that intensive if they feel, yes, this is something appropriate. I think just by, as people look down the list of headings of the intensives, one or two or three will be appealing and one or two will not be appealing. And so, I suspect that in each intensive, the people that will be there because, yes, this feels like it is important for me now. So, yeah, that's part of what the intensive is about.
I see. So is like the so-called Kundalini awakening when there's a sudden spontaneous opening of blockages so strong that the sense of self just completely dissipates instantly? Is that what it is?
Um, uh, there's many different pathways, and I think the a Kundalini awakening is a particular um, journey, particular pathway. However, I think a lot of other pathways have a secondary component of Kundalini movement within them, because of the fact that they are not indistinguishable. They are linked to each other, given that the beliefs are energetic. So you don't necessarily have to be on a Kundalini path to have to experience shifts and energetic movements that would be classified as Kundalini energy moving through the chakras and opening up blocks. But that doesn't mean you're going to have a full Kundalini style awakening, which would be someone who is very specifically finding their journey to be about visions and colors and a very specific movement through the chakras. If you're on a different path, those movements are going to be incidental and secondary. So I wouldn't necessarily be talking about, energy bursting through the crown chakra, because that isn't my experience. I know that I have no reason to doubt that it's a valid path and that certain people awaken through that movement. But I would be talking about energetic movements, which would include a lot of releasing of energies from the system that, when they are released, will mean we feel very different. Chalk and cheese about an event, that has happened, and the relationship to that event once the energies have come out, the relationship to the event can change radically, and that's a great sign that it's not someone with an attitude towards an event because they choose to have that attitude, but rather because the attitude is put in place by the energetic structure. So if that energetic structure comes out and changes, then automatically the attitude to a person, let's say, can change instantaneously. So I'm not sure that even a Kundalini awakening is instantaneous. I think it's quite progressive, but often the way that these things are described is, people will be a bit careless with their descriptions, and because there was a significant change at the point of a Kundalini awakening, they might not describe the subsequent changes that happened after that might have gone on for many, many years. And if they do include descriptions of changes that continue to happen many years after the awakening, and we see the lead up to the awakening, we might then realize that maybe there isn't such a thing as a spontaneous, enlightenment, as is described and often interpreted to be, it was X before and after it was Y, and that's all there is, X and Y. And I think it's, like most things, much more gradual, with certain very significant events that, when seen from a certain perspective, seem instantaneous.
I see. That helps a lot. So would you say that, developing a practice where you kind of allow yourself or encourage yourself to feel these spasms and muscle twitching, is that also gradually deconditioning these beliefs out of your system. Like a lot of people now say fear and trauma is actually physically stored in the body. So is that releasing them and thereby, I guess, diminishing that sense of being a separate, fearful self? Is that kind of how it works?
Yes, I would say so. So you know, sometimes you don't even know what's happening, but if there are these physical twitches and jerks and strange dreams, visions, I would suggest that that is change happening, and it's change that I would suggest is worth surrendering into, understanding that there is a force at play that is much more capable of sorting out that problem than we are. And so to get out of the way and have the attitude that this is the process in action is probably the most effective attitude. And because I do agree that the beliefs and the traumas are stored in the body, there's also a validity in manipulating the body and moving the body, especially muscles that might be quite tense, because a lot of the tension and pains in the body are not as physical as they might feel, or at least it's physical, we feel them, but their root cause is not as physiological as we might imagine. I've had a situation when a lot of these energies were moving through that I was walking in the forest and suddenly I felt like I had a fractured or broken shin. It really, the pain in my shin was so sensitive and sharp that it felt like the bone was broken. And it coincided with a movement of energy in the body that was pretty heavy, and so I had my own techniques of trying to release energies by massaging certain muscles. And once the heaviness gets to a certain point, I would find that it would just come out. And as it in this situation, it came out. And as soon as the energetic release had happened, the pain that I was very concerned about as being a fractured bone was completely gone. And I could then walk, and frankly, the whole system felt lighter and free, as if something that was inhabiting the system had been ushered out. And very importantly, the sense that I had a physical broken bone completely vanished and disappeared. So there is merit in, I think, deep tissue manipulation for yourself. Sometimes going and getting a practitioner to do it is useful, but I think you can start to do it yourself. And if that does lead to emotional movements or energetic movements in the body, and you can see the correlation between the two, then that is very encouraging for someone to carry on and to start understanding the relationship between the body and the emotions and the old ideas and the traumas and all of that. And it's not necessarily as straightforward as it sounds. It took me many years to see, or many months maybe, to see the correlation, because the emotional movements in the body might arise 5 or 6 hours after the manipulation of the muscles, and so it takes a presence of mind to match the dots up, I guess. But it is very much a process that I think anyone can develop if a few pointers are handed out.
See, that makes a lot of sense. Can you also elicit those reactions just simply like doing those body scan meditations where just by putting your concentrated attention on a certain body part, like that's been my experience. If I focus my attention on where I feel constricted, I my body will just spontaneously start trembling and shaking and sometimes kicking, and that seems to be some kind of release. Although I don't know for sure because nobody's really taught me how to do this, but it seems like I've been doing it for months now, and over the course of months, my experience of that seems to have changed. Like the the strength of the energetic surges seems to have changed, and along with that, my sense of self, for some reason, strangely seems to have changed also. And I was, what is that typical, and is that, I guess, part of the process?
I put a yes to all of that. I definitely think it's the process, and it will, it's not something you're doing. I'm sure you appreciate that. Is you sort of intuitively move from one step to another, and then because certain outcomes happen, we learn, and in effect, the process unfolds, and the kicking, the twitching, the surrendering to the feeling, allowing the body to just move, and the body moving without you making an effort, but rather with clearly some other energies that are not voluntary, moving the body. That to me is very much a release. And if now there's a difference between expressing and releasing. If someone just expresses their hatred, their shame, without having a background and a framework of doership and attachment to outcome, the small sense of self versus your true nature, and a lot of the things that are delivered through seeking processes and seeking frameworks. Without that, someone essentially could be just reliving trauma and reinforcing the idea, yes, of course I hate them for what they did, and just reinforcing it. So there's a difference between just just expressing, which I think tends not to undo the root energetic systems, versus being immersed in a system that in itself starts to loosen things and move things, because our ideas of doership and attachment on the outer level, on the daily living level, starts to change, and that eventually sinks into the body and goes deeper and deeper and starts uprooting the deeply ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome. And so then when those energies move and get expressed, they're not just being expressed, they're being released. Because on the conscious side of things, our attitude is no longer the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And what we see in those energies, when we get to feel them and see the attitude behind them, is we see those energies are full of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And if we don't get to see them, it doesn't mean that, like, if they don't come up in a way that is felt, rage or sadness, grief, and there's just physical movements, it, to me, is probably the same. It's the same attitude being released in a way that is not mental. And as long as the framework is there that has started to diminish the attachment and the taking life personally on a present day level, it makes complete sense that these energies that are not in congruence with that, the old energies that are in congruence with the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, the body is not now resonating at that same frequency. So when when we were looking at present day through that same lens, it was effectively keeping the body in a particular frequency. So as things start changing on the conscious level and on our present day attitude, it means this old attitude just doesn't have the same container, and the container starts to spit that old attitude out. And that's what is referred to as a deepening of the understanding, which starts off as an intellectual understanding where we go, oh, I get what you mean, that I will be very aggressive in a situation because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so the other is very aggressive because of their genes and up-to-date conditioning, and it's not as personal as I might have processed it previously. Okay, I get that intellectually. And then as we start contemplating it more and more, it starts going deeper and deeper from intellectual, and it starts affecting how we judge people in everyday life today, present day. And then as that starts to become more and more our natural way of seeing things, then these old attitudes, the old traumas that were put in place, they're not compatible anymore, so they're going to get kicked out eventually. Oh, and then you're going to feel different, right? Because the old sense of self, the small sense of self, is being evacuated from the body, so you're going to feel less of that and more of what's left behind.
I see. So it's sort of important as you're experiencing the bodily sensations and twitching, what kind of mental attitude you have at the moment. And because I think some people experience memories when they're having these sensations, but I have none. My mind is totally blank. It's just my body just twitching and so forth. So I assume that would be deconditioning, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's still happening in a non pictorial or visual or mental way. So you can't see what is being released, but what is moving the body is that energy. So I'd say it's still a release. It's not important to have the attitude while the energy is being released. In fact, I would suggest at the very time, if it is coming out in the form of emotions, where there is crying and shouting and verbal words, not necessarily to anyone, just in your room or in the forest or whatever, then you don't apply any of the wisdom, as in any of the concepts that says, things like hatred is part of the doer identity. None of that narrative is important at that time. In fact, it's best suspended and just allowing the energies to release themselves in the full hatred. Like, that's what the energy is, so allow the energy to be of full hatred. What is important is that the understanding of non-doership and non-attachment has been setting in over the months prior, let's say. And then shortly after that energetic release has happened, then there might be a retrospective looking at what has happened and a marveling at, wow, look at the energy, because you can feel in certain emotions, you can feel the intensity of rage that you might never have known was there. And when you feel it, it can even sort of scare you a little bit, like, wow, that was intense. And so there can be a marveling in retrospect at the doership that was there, that was in that energy, the intense hatred towards another for what they have done to me, that was in the energy taken to be a complete attack on who I am. And so that retrospective appreciation of that energy, especially in regard to doership and attachment to outcome, is is very important. Now, that's obviously only going to happen if there is a foundation of doership and attachment to outcomes in place. So in the very moment of the energy, just I suggest we be as enlightened as the energy is. The liberated view can come in afterwards.
Great, thanks. That was very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. I think maybe we'll take one more and I'll keep it very quick. Hey, Tony. Hello, Tony. Might be quicker than we thought. Is there someone else? No. All right. Well, some people asked or referred to the intensives, so I think they're online as of today. So on the website, under the events section, there are the 5 intensives, one each month. I think the first one is starting on the 26th of July. They go for 6 days, one session every day for 6 days. The sessions are 2 hours long, and so that 6-day intensive will focus on that particular topic, the particular topic of the intensive. So feel free to join up. Love to see as many of you there as feel inclined to join. Till next week.